Hello and welcome to our content event, Future Proofing Content, Putting Customers First. My name is Stephan Delbos, Senior Director of Product Content at Mews. And the purpose of tonight is really to create a space for people who are involved in content to discuss some of the changes that we see happening in content these days and try to come up with some ideas about where things are headed and how content teams can prepare, and really to compare notes from different disciplines across content, different companies, different approaches, and see if we can come away with some ideas that might be usable and practical for the future. If you like what you hear tonight, I strongly encourage you to check out our amazing blog from our technical writing manager, Radhika Code, Writing for User Disengagement, the Mews approach. And please do scan the QR code and that will take you to the blog, which kind of summarizes the Mews philosophy around content and the relationship between content and customer or user, which might be counterintuitive, this idea of disengagement as opposed to engagement, which we normally hear about with content. And some of those ideas that are featured in the blog will certainly be mentioned tonight. But I've recently had 3 interesting conversations that led me to want to put this panel discussion together. And the first one was talking to a friend of mine recently who asked me, essentially, aren't you thinking about changing careers because we have AI, and why do we need writers now? We have large language models. Isn't your role essentially useless now, or won't it be useless very soon? We have LLMs to do all the writing for us. And I said a few 4-letter words to him, which I won't repeat, but it got me thinking, yes, we do still need writers is the short answer, but the details are a little bit more complicated. But that question, I think, is one that many content teams are facing now, and it's one that content teams really need to face up to. Content teams work with language, and large language models work with language, and so that challenge needs to be met head on. Another conversation I had recently was with a user, and the user was asking, essentially, why can't you personalize my content so that it meets my specific needs? And at a high growth scale up like Mews, we have a proliferating number of users, thousands and thousands and thousands of users. And each of those users wants content that is personally tailored to what they need to do, which poses a very specific challenge. At the same time that we need to produce more content, users are demanding that we produce more tailored content. And that's a crux that I think many content teams find themselves in as well. And then talking to a colleague, I was asked, how is our content team driving revenue and business goals? Which again, I think is something that every content team in this atmosphere, this landscape is really forced to answer that question. And this question is becoming more important and more dramatic than ever. Talking about revenue per employee, talking about scaling without adding headcount, and also like reevaluating everything that the company is doing, including content, and looking at things that we've long considered needs or necessities, like release notes and help articles, and asking the question, like, how are those things contributing to revenue? How are those things driving our business goals? And so I think content teams in 2025 are in a unique position, and they're kind of getting pinched from 3 different directions. We've got AI, which everyone is talking about. We've got this drive for personalization and scaling at the same time, and then a greater focus than ever on revenue. And so I have some ideas of how to answer these questions, but I don't have all the answers. And so I thought that assembling different disciplines, different experts from the content space would allow us to have a fruitful conversation and try to address some of these challenges that I think content teams are facing across industries in all sorts of different companies. But let me back up a little bit and specify exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about content teams. And content comes in many shapes and sizes, many forms. But tonight, I think we have a pretty representative sample of some of the different types of content that is prevalent, certainly at tech companies. So we have a representative of technical writing. We have someone from marketing. We have someone from knowledge management and someone from content design. And these four disciplines, while they're all related to writing, essentially creating text, they all take a different approach. They all have different purposes. Technical writing typically involved in instructing the user how to use new features and new products. Marketing, trying to get more users, try to turn prospective users into current users, and really trying to obviously sell and upsell. Knowledge management, making sure that both internally and externally, teams are creating a knowledge base that can be used in order to facilitate more efficient working, both within the company and within the users. And then finally, content design, actually creating the products and creating the features that are going to work very well for a user or, perhaps work less well. And when I think about why we have content teams, what is the strategic value of content, whether it's marketing, content design, knowledge management, or technical writing, I think about these three things primarily. Feature adoption and customer acquisition, which when done correctly leads to increased revenue, faster growth, greater retention. I think about self-service, which leads to lower support costs and more scalable customer success. And thinking about knowledge management, which again, when done well, leads to greater operational efficiency and execution speed. And here, this is how I kind of visualize the value cycle of content across these four areas. So it begins here on the left when a new feature is being created or a new product is being created. Content teams are involved in designing that feature. They're involved in localizing that feature, and they're involved in documenting it as well. Upon release of the feature, content teams are announcing that. So whether that's marketing, trying to sell and upsell, or product content and technical writers with release notes telling current users, we have a new feature, here's how to use it. And then ideally, if everything's set up and working well, the content teams are then monitoring the effects of the content that they have created, the actual feature or product that they've helped design, and then the documentation, which should be leading to greater self-service, lower support tickets, greater feature adoption. And then ideally, as content teams are monitoring these things in the newly released features and products, they're then going to be making fixes to the product based on what they're seeing in customer support. They're going to be identifying knowledge gaps in the help center. If there are a lot of questions coming in which should be met or should be answered in the help articles, they're going to make changes to the help articles to make sure those answers are there. And so they're not just auditing and making improvements to the documentation, but ideally they're also changing the product itself based on the feedback that they're getting from users. And then of course, they would ideally measure the impact of those changes. They would document what they've learned about this particular feature and then apply it to the next feature or product that is built and released. In my experience, most content teams really focus on these two parts, and these two parts for various reasons, sometimes because the data isn't there, sometimes because there's already another feature to be worked on. But in my experience, those last two blocks on the right and on the bottom are often left undone. And I think that is a key opportunity for content teams to complete this cycle of value. But completing this cycle of value or even establishing this cycle of value is more challenging than ever because the landscape is changing really rapidly. And when I think about content now in 2025 and in the last year, it really has shifted and changed more than it has in my entire career from the beginning until now. AI and automation, two major shifts in the last year or so that have become really critical for content teams. The pressure is on to use AI. There's kind of rosy glasses that everyone is wearing about AI, thinking it's going to solve all our problems. It's a silver bullet. It can do everything. In practice, it's much more complex. Connected with that is the fact that there's greater pressure now than ever to produce more and more content. With AI, we have the ability to produce infinite amounts of content. I was on a panel on AI and content with business leaders from around Europe, people from the BBC, Tommy Hilfiger, and a marketing executive at Tommy Hilfiger said that last year with AI, they produced 250,000 more pieces of content than they had the year before. And 2% of that content was actually used. So there's this pressure to create more content, but that content is not necessarily being used for any, measurable or impactful purpose. And so how do we balance that, I think, is a real important question for content teams these days. Shifting customer expectations. As I mentioned, I think there's a growing desire for tailored content, personalized content, which is very easy to do when you have one user. But when you have 100,000 users, to create this type of personalized content is a real challenge, and potentially is not worth the effort, essentially. And sometimes difficult answers need to be given to customers or users in that regard. I think there's also an increased pressure to scale without headcount. This is certainly connected to AI. And I think many content teams are caught in a kind of catch-22 where they are pressured to use AI. And then when they do use AI and show the increased productivity that they get from AI, we've increased our productivity by 50%. They're then told, well, I guess we can cut the team by 50%. And that is, as I said, this kind of catch-22 that I think content teams are stuck in these days. And then also the greater need for data to show content's business impact. Traditionally, content has relied on metrics like engagement to judge the effectiveness of what the teams are producing. But engagement essentially is a vanity metric that makes content teams feel good, but doesn't necessarily connect to business goals. And along with this pressure to scale without adding headcount, I think there's a greater pressure in this market, in the current climate, to really show the business value of every content decision, of every piece of content that's produced. So things are changing very, very quickly, both because of technology, because of the economic climate, the business climate, and I think a lot of content teams are trying to figure out what to do. And maybe we'll come to some of those answers tonight. Because I think there are a lot of places where content teams still get it wrong, even with the best intentions. That balance between scalability and personalization. Personalized content, tailored content is great, but how do you do that at scale without having an infinite number of people to produce the content? Then thinking about silos between teams and stakeholders. Typically, content teams are very cross-functional. I know in the case of Mews, our technical writers, our content designers are embedded into product teams. Our localization team is working with teams across the company. And we have a very interesting perspective to see just how siloed these these teams are. The left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. But the question is then, what do you do with that knowledge? When you see those silos, is it your responsibility to break them down? And if it is, how do you do it? Also, I think there's what I like to call the metrics trap. Everyone talks about being data-driven. But I know at least one data person in the room who suggests that we should be guided by data rather than driven by data. And I think often content teams can find themselves in this trap where there's a pressure to measure everything, but the data isn't always there. The reporting isn't always there. Certainly when we think about content design, often there are changes or designs that we're making that we know instinctively are better, but we don't really have a way of measuring how it's better after the changes that we've made. And I think ideally, every content team is in a position where if they can't measure something, they don't do it. But that only works in a really mature organization where the data is there, the reporting is there, and it can be very, very difficult to get to that position. With all this pressure, to scale, to produce more content, I think content teams can also get caught up in this trap of being really focused on delivery. The day-to-day avalanche of new tickets and new tasks can be overwhelming. And it's very easy to fall into this mode of like, I wrote this, I sent this. I have to write this, I sent this. And it can be very easy to forget about the user. When we're focused purely on delivery, we can often forget about the most important person in the conversation who always should be the user. And I think if content teams can really put the user at the heart of everything they do, they'll be much better positioned. And then finally, I think with all of these pressures, we're often missing opportunities to instruct and delight. Especially when we think about technical writing, which tends to be, or stereotypically would be considered dry, not so creative. I think often we forget the importance of delight, and that we forget that technical writers, for example, are not just writing technical documentation, but they're designing the customer experience. For me, documentation is part of the product. So what technical writers do is not somehow extraneous to what designers and PMs and everyone working on products and features do. It's really inherent. It's an inherent part. And if the documentation isn't there, then the product isn't complete. But when we're thinking about how content teams help design customer experience, of course we want to have a delightful customer experience. So remembering that and keeping that in mind, I think is another challenge, is something that we miss, an opportunity that we often miss. But of course, out of challenges come opportunities. And I think there are many opportunities for content teams today to transform what they're doing, and by transforming what they're doing, transform the user experience, transform the company, transform the product. But I think that can only happen if we focus on these three things. We need to start with the customer. In an ideal situation, at a tech company, you have a robust UX research function, you have a robust design function, you have a robust engineering function, product management, and all of those people should be focused on the customer. But in reality, that's not how it works often, right? And those pressures that content teams face to deliver, for example, everyone's facing those. Engineers, are faced with the pressure to deliver. PMs are faced with the pressure to ship as quickly as possible. And often I find that product teams can get so caught up in their own OKRs that they forget the most important person, which is the user. But I think content teams are uniquely positioned to really serve the user and to keep the user at the center of the conversation. And I think that's one key, starting with the customer, starting with the user. That's one key element of the opportunity that I see content teams having to transform businesses. I think also it's important that content teams balance technology and human insight. At Mews, we've leaned into AI significantly over the past year and a half. But what we've found, and what leading experts with AI have found, is that you always need a human in the loop. And where people who are not on the ground in content on a daily basis can just think, why can't we just use AI to write all the documentation we need? Why can't we just use AI to translate everything we need? But in reality, it doesn't work that well. It's not quite so simple. So I think it's important that content teams embrace the technology, but they embrace it with a grain of salt, in a sense, that they are positioned to balance human insight with technology. And then also, I think a kind of emphasized value that content teams can have is in breaking down silos. As I said, generally content teams are really cross-functional, and that means they have this point of view, a holistic point of view on the product and on the company that other teams don't have, right? If you're in product team X, you're focusing on what you're building, you're focusing on your OKRs and your metrics and hitting those and shipping as quickly as possible. You have no idea what product team Y is doing. And potentially there can be duplication of work. There can even be, conflicting work that's happening. And I think generally content teams are positioned to point those things out and to break down some of these silos.